Good morning. Now, this video is a bit of a departure for me as I don't usually talk about politics on the channel, but this particular video has been coming for some time, and it was actually sparked, in part at least recently, by conversations I've been having with some of my Brexit supporting family and friends, because yep, I'm going to be talking about Brexit. So if you don't want to hear it, run and hide, and I'll be back to normal with the next one, hopefully. And look, the reality is that, like a lot of people, my family's divided on this issue, and, we all have different opinions. But unlike some families, I've not split with my sisters over it. And as far as I'm aware, I've not lost, very many friends. I think I may have lost one over it. But frankly, if someone's going to cut you off just because you disagree with them on a particular issue, well, they may not have been your friend in the first place anyway. The reality is I don't hate Brexiters. I just think they're wrong. And in this video, I want to talk about why I think they're wrong and why it is that they're seemingly incapable of admitting that very obvious fact. Because I do think that it's become an obvious fact. Now, there are many reasons why Brexiters may not want to admit this, but I think one of them's a simple, logical fallacy, and it's called the sunk cost fallacy. And what's the sunk cost fallacy? Well, I saw somebody on YouTube trying to explain it, and they did a pretty decent job, and I'll put a link into their video. But basically it comes down to you walk halfway to a shop because you want some milk or whatever, and halfway there you realise that the shop's actually shut. But instead of turning around and going home and drinking a cold drink instead of that cup of tea you wanted with the milk in it, you continue going because you don't want to waste the time and effort you've already spent getting as far as you have, despite the fact that going the whole way isn't going to actually achieve anything. And look, that's how I think Brexiters have approached Brexit. They've invested so much into it now that they can't turn around and walk away. And look, I know some have. Some people have changed their minds because from what I can gather, the actual results now, if you take a poll, are that more people now support staying in than leaving. Depends on the poll, obviously. But some people have changed their minds. But a lot of people have just continued to double down and then double down again. And for those of you who don't know, Brexit was a referendum that was held in the UK to ask if we wanted to leave the EU. And unfortunately for people like me, the vote, such as it was, and I'll get to that in a minute, went the way of leave. And lots of things happened immediately after that. And I noticed a few things straight away. And I argued with people at the time. I was actually buying parts for a computer not long after the vote, and I noticed immediately that prices were starting to move up as a result of the pound plummeting, because the pound dropped off a cliff following the vote. And I was lucky enough to have some money that I'd been saving for my PC, and so I bought most of the parts before the prices went up too much. Nevertheless, the prices did start to rise. Around about that time, I also went on holiday to Europe, and day on day, our money was worth less. Every time we went to the bank to draw some more money, the exchange rate was favouring us less and less. And as I say, that was almost on a daily basis. And yet, I had friends and family telling me a while later that the pound had recovered. And when I talk to some of my Brexit friends, even now, they tell me that the pound has recovered, despite the fact that a quick Google search will show you that it hasn't. And while all this was going on, the pound was also suffering losses against the dollar, hence the increases in price for PC parts because they're traded internationally using the dollar. And, that's to be expected because the effects on the pound don't just affect us in relation to Europe, they affect us in relation to the entire world. And of course, around that time, the euro was also impacted against the dollar as well, because I hate to tell you this, Brexiters, but us leaving Europe does have an effect on Europe. Obviously, they sometimes cite this as an argument in their favour. Oh, wow, the EU has got problems with their currency as well because, when we voted to leave, their currency dropped against the dollar as well. But think about that for a moment. That's like saying that sitting in a sinking boat with someone is a win because they'll drown too. And you see this repeated over and over in a more general sense as well. I've had Brexit supporting friends of mine gloat about this idea that the EU is over, that the EU's finished. Like somehow that's a good thing. Because even with us out, having the euro fall apart and having the EU fall apart destabilises Europe. And a destabilised Europe can't possibly be good for the UK. Can it? I mean, you tell me. Do you really think our closest trading partners falling apart and suffering a drop in their currency will be good for us? I honestly, I can't see it. But if you've got a good argument for that, come and tell me in the comments. With all due respect to Brexiters, they don't seem to be able to grasp simple facts. I keep hearing that the majority of the British people voted for Brexit, but only about a third of the British people voted to leave. Another third voted to remain, and the remaining 30 or so % didn't bother to vote at all. Hardly a resounding victory, is it? And that's before we even start getting into the thorny issue of the lies perpetrated by the various Leave campaign groups and organisations. Try as you might, you can't get away from the fact that we had lies plastered all over a bus telling us that we would have more money for the NHS. You can't get away from the racist poster put up by Farage and his cronies about immigration, where everybody wasn't white. Surprise, surprise. You can't get away from all the stuff about laws that were imposed upon us by the EU. Take back control was the slogan, when in fact, actually, British politics has been in turmoil for at least 3 years since the referendum. That's the reality. And we've spent so much money on getting Brexit done, another slogan, that it would have taken many, many more years of membership to have spent the same amount. So much for saving money then. And on the subject of money, here's a quote from the Irish Times regarding the misuse of funds by Vote Leave and various other groups. In early 2016, Darren Grimes, a 21-year-old fashion student from Durham, set up a social media campaign to encourage young people to vote to leave the European Union. Believe, as it was called, raised the princely sum of £21.51 in 3 months. Then, in the 2 weeks before the Brexit referendum, Grimes received a series of massive donations, including $625,000 from the Vote Leave campaign. This money, it was subsequently discovered, was paid directly to a Canadian data analytics firm called Aggregate IQ. It was never even resting in the young student's account. Sound dodgy to you? Because it certainly sounds dodgy to me. And yet, whenever you raise these kind of things with Brexiters, they say, oh wow, the Remainers lied as well. Okay, what did they lie about? Really, what did they lie about? Because everything I heard from the experts that we're told not to listen to anymore actually came to pass. The pound dropped. The UK economy went into the doldrums. Nothing that we saw that was promised as a result of Brexit has come to pass. All the things we were warned about, or at least a significant number of the things we were warned about, like the pound falling, have happened. You can say that Remain lied as well and reiterate the slogan Project Fear as much as you like, but there was nothing, literally nothing, to compare to the industrial scale of the lies and deceit perpetrated on the British public by Vote Leave. And this is a quote from the Electoral Commission. It's not what I say. Even if the Remain side had lied to the same scale, though, well, that only strengthens the argument to disregard the referendum result as unsafe, doesn't it? Because one lot lying is bad enough. But if everybody lies, well, can you actually make a decision based on lies? Can you? And it gets even worse, because the referendum, and don't start arguing with me until you've heard all of this, the referendum was advisory. Now, that in itself means that they didn't have to follow through, but it gets worse. Here's some more from the Irish Times. Remarkably, unlike a general election, the victory in the referendum cannot be challenged in an election court because the vote was not legally binding. Think about that for a minute. Here's a quote from Daniel Zeitner. He's the Labour MP for Cambridge, and he was actually arguing in favour of a second referendum. But the point is interesting. This is what he said. There will be lawyers in this chamber who will know far more than me, but one aspect of the legal debate begins with the status of the referendum itself. In the Supreme Court judgment made in December 2016, when the government were being challenged on the need for parliamentary approval to trigger Article 50, it was judged that the EU referendum was not legally binding but advisory. So logically, it cannot be ordered to be rerun by a court. The decision about whether to go back to the public after a referendum is not a legal judgment. It is a political one. The decision lies with us. As I say, he was arguing for Parliament to be able to put a referendum to the people, a second referendum to the people. But if you actually read between the lines of what he's actually saying that because it wasn't legally binding, the courts have no say. So even if it was shown, as it has been shown repeatedly, that Vote Leave broke the law, there's no legal recourse. And Bim Afalami, the Tory MP for Hitchin and Harpenden, takes this and runs with it. This is what he says. He has mentioned rightly that in legal terms the referendum was advisory and not legally binding. Therefore, the nexus between the trigger of Article 50 and the referendum is weaker than if the referendum had been legally binding. Does that not weaken the case for the referendum result to be overturned or for Article 50 to be rescinded, because Parliament is making an even more independent judgment than would otherwise have been the case? Interesting that he's arguing for the courts not to get involved when there was a chance that they actually might overturn the referendum result. And, you know, Bim Afalami is someone that I've actually spoken to. I spoke to him during the recent election campaign, and he was a pretty personable guy and I quite liked him. But if he really believes that hiding behind the legalities of an advisory referendum in order to avoid it being overturned because of financial irregularities and what would have been serious breaches of the law had it not been advisory, well, then he's not to be trusted. And as I say, it's also really interesting to note that at this stage, the Tories were very, very keen on Parliament having the say. Whereas later on down the line, when it looked like Parliament might put a stop to their shenanigans, well, they started to try and turn people against Parliament. Sovereign Parliament. Take back control until you don't like that control. That's what seems to be happening here. And in the face of all these machinations and manoeuvrings, we had the reality. As I said before, the pound dropped off a cliff. We had companies pulling out of the UK, banking also looking to move out of the UK, EU nationals worried about their future in the UK, UK nationals worried about their future in the EU. We were no longer able to live, study and work freely in the UK, or at least we won't be. There's the potential loss of EU funding to poorer regions in the UK. Most of those poorer regions voting for Brexit, like Turkey's voting for Christmas. And then we have a situation where some of those regions, like Cornwall, voted leave and then almost immediately turned around and started petitioning the UK government to make up for the shortfall. I mean, you couldn't make it up. The NHS has a massive shortage of nurses and doctors, caused in part at least by EU nationals leaving the country following the Brexit vote. Yeah, get rid of all those foreigners who are helping to keep people alive. How's that going for you now that we've got COVID-19? Even the hospital set up to deal with COVID-19 patients was unable to get enough nurses. Seriously. And I think it's shutting down now because of lower cases, but they couldn't operate fully even if they'd have wanted to because they couldn't get the nurses they needed. There's a very real possibility of the Troubles returning to Ireland. You know, the Good Friday Agreement is part of the EU agreement. And Scotland? Well, Scotland could leave the Union and rejoin the EU. Now, I don't expect that to happen straight away, but it's likely to happen down the line. And people will say, oh, Project Fear again. But we know that the Scottish National Party will agitate to get away from the Union. You know, it's only a matter of time. If things go badly after Brexit, and if you actually listen to the experts that no one wants to listen to, it's likely to go bad. Well, as I say, it's only a matter of time. And bringing it back to a subject that's more relevant to my core audience for a moment, even such things as the PEGI gaming ratings will have to be looked at because it's an EU rating scheme and we'll have to set up our own. And people might say, oh, well, that's a small thing. Well, yeah, it is quite a small thing in and of itself. But multiply that by all the other schemes that we'll have to replicate and all the money that that will cost. Just think about it for a second. All the money that we're going to have to spend setting up new agencies to deal with things that are currently organised through and with the EU. The fact is that all our current trade deals are made through the EU. So if we don't get a deal sorted with the EU by the end of the year, we could find ourselves out in the cold. Oh, and by the way, that could be around the time when we get a second wave of COVID-19 infections. Because if the virus follows the same path as the Spanish flu, then we haven't experienced the worst of it yet. And good luck with importing PPE if we don't have any trade deals. And good luck importing food too. And frankly, that's just the tip of the iceberg. But, you know, let's put all that aside for a moment. Let's talk about the pros of Brexit. Because despite all this, when I talk to Brexiters, they ignore it all. And they repeat Project Fear, that mantra that got out there because, you know, the likes of Dominic Cummings and dear old Boris are really good at coming up with slogans. They're just not so good at actually doing anything. And like I say, much of this is a matter of public record. It's not Project Fear to note that the pound has dropped off a cliff since the Brexit vote. It's a fact. It's not Project Fear that the NHS is struggling with massive staff shortages as a result of EU nationals up in sticks and leaving. It's a fact. It's not Project Fear that has led to friends of mine wondering if they have a future in the UK despite living and working here and paying taxes here, incidentally, for decades. I know people who've lived here longer than they lived in their countries of origin, and yet They don't feel welcome here, and the government's not doing anything to help that. The EU is by far our biggest trading partner, in part because it's closer to us than anywhere else. I know you might not realise that, Dominic Raab, but it's the case. You know, it's the same reason New Zealand buys the lion's share of its cars from Japan rather than Europe. And yet, Brexiters claim we can magically start selling cars we make to New Zealand, assuming we're still making cars because those companies are Japanese and they've started to pull out. How can we sell to New Zealand? Why would they buy those cars when they can get them cheaper from Japan? Brexiters don't know the answer to these questions because they've never actually thought about the logistics of it. Perhaps because that's just too painful and it's easier to just ignore all the experts who are trying to explain that it makes no sense. No sense whatsoever. And that's the problem. How can you argue with someone who seems to have taken to heart Michael Gove's declaration that people are fed up with experts? You can't. There's no real common ground because Brexiters have insulated themselves against the facts as surely as any religious zealot has insulated themselves against any evidence that might undermine their faith. Like a religious zealot declaring that Christ is their vaccine, Brexiters parrot "Get Brexit Done" or Project Fear because it's easier to repeat a slogan than to actually think about what it might actually mean. Because that's what Brexit has become for a lot of people, a religion. And just as it becomes extremely difficult to convince someone who's invested years in believing that Jesus turned water into wine, cast demons out into pigs, or flew up to heaven after dying on a cross and escaping a sealed tomb, that they might just be mistaken, so it is with Brexit. People who believe strongly in something despite all the evidence to the contrary often won't thank you for pointing out to them that there's a good chance that they're wrong. In fact, like the guy who gets halfway to the shop only to realise it's closed, they will likely hunker down and redouble their efforts. The guy walking to the shop might even get annoyed with anyone who points out that they're wasting their time. They might even come up with some justification as to why they're still trudging to the shop, even though they now know it's shut. And that's what a lot of Brexiters are doing. They know deep down that the Brexit shop is shut, but they still keep walking towards it, doggedly determined to get there no matter what. And don't you dare tell them that it was the store owner who lied to them about the shop being open. They'll hate you for it.